Disclaimer: in 2019 I was invited by the Panzermuseum Munster and the Tank Museum at Bovington. Since it has been confirmed that Russia has sent T-62s to Ukraine as previously discussed in another video, I thought I would take a look at the T-62 and also some major difference to the more common T-72. In this case I will also look at some factors that might seem odd, like the number of current operators, because this could actually be of major importance. The T-62 was not a revolutionary tank, it was a solid improvement on the T-55, with which it shared various important components. It also looked very similar. Here are 3 points on how you can tell the difference between the T-55 and T-62. First, the T-62 has gaps before and after the second to last track wheel, as you can see here. In contrast, the very similar looking T-54s and T-55 have the gap after the first track wheel. Additionally, the turret is shaped slightly differently, although that is harder to spot. Another major difference is the location of the bore evacuator. On the T-55 it is near the end of the barrel, whereas for the T-62 it is more or less in the middle. Now, although the T-62 itself was not that revolutionary, it came with some very interesting improvements. Kinnear and Sewell noted that the tank had 4 important achievements. It was the first Soviet tank to mount a high-powered 150mm smoothbore gun. It was the first Soviet tank to use armor-piercing fin-stabilized discarding sabot ammunition. It was only produced in the Soviet Union and not licensed for production in Warsaw Pact countries as with the T-34, T-54 and T-55, although the Democratic Republic of Korea received a conditional license to produce their version of the tank. And it was the last simple tank produced as an example of the first generation of post-war Soviet tanks. This is mostly in line with Zaloga's view, although he adds a very important point, namely that there was a major shift with the Soviet Union's export policy and that a large number of T-62s were exported. This is actually quite interesting and tricky because the tank was barely used in the Warsaw Pact countries, but heavily exported into the Middle East and some other regions. Polish and Czech sources suggest that the reasons were in part due to cost. The sale price of the T-62 was 250,000 rubles, which is about 50% greater than the cost of the T-55 at the time. Furthermore, senior Warsaw Pact officials were aware that the Soviet army was adopting the new T-64A as their universal tank, so a short-term transition to the T-62 hardly seemed worth the effort. Even within the Soviet Union, the T-62 was first merely seen as a stopgap solution, according to Zaloga, until the T-64 would go into mass production. Yet due to serious delays, the T-62 actually was produced in large numbers and actually became the mainstay of the Soviet army in the 1970s. Indeed, by 1973 the T-62 constituted over 75% of the Soviet army premier tank units in the group of Soviet forces Germany. This differs partially to Kinnear and Sewell's views that note the T-62 tank was at the time of its introduction just what the Soviet army wanted, as it was little different in operation and maintenance from its T-54 and T-55 predecessors, and having few sophisticated systems, it was easily mastered by raw recruits over a 5-month training schedule. Keep in mind that there were several views within the Soviet Union and also some views changed. As such, these statements are less contradictory and more complementary to each other. In total, about 19,000 T-62s were produced in an 11-year time span. Over the course of its lifetime, there were several modifications for the T-62 in order to improve armor protection, mobility and firepower, like the ability to fire anti-tank guided missiles through the gun barrel. Of particular importance here is the resolution from July 1981, so 1.5 years into the Afghan war. These included new fire controls, a laser rangefinder, supplemental passive armor, the so-called BOD package for the hull and turret, more powerful engines, steel-reinforced rubberized fabric side skirts, more dynamic suspension, and the addition of a through-the-bore anti-tank missile capability. Initially, 785 T-62 tanks were to be modified to the standard over 5 years, becoming the T-62M, when fitted with the anti-tank guided missile capability, and the T-64M1 without it. There were several M configurations similarly numbered with the detail right down to where the hyphens were placed as follows. Something I'm not going to read out. In short, there are 6 T-62M variants listed on the screen. So as you can see, not all T-62Ms were created equal. The BDD applique armor on the turret, as you can see here, was popularly known as brow armor. It was a composite armor of layered steel plates and the cavities filled with polyfurane. So it was similar to the early NATO Chobham armor. The new turret armor increased the tank's protection from its basic 210mm fixed steel to a steel equivalent of 380 against kinetic energy protectors such as armor-piercing fin destabilized discarding saber, and 450mm against shape charge protectors such as high explosive anti-tank and missile warheads. An optional kit was also prepared to protect the rear of the turret and parts of the hull from RPG attack using several panels of lightweight slats. Reshekti. The experience in Afghanistan, particularly in Minefield, led to an armor package for the tank belly. This included mounting the driver's seat to the hull side. This generally helps to reduce injuries to the spine of the crew that come from the shock waves. Something explained in my video on IEDs versus tanks. There was another upgrade package in 1985. This time the T-61Ms were upgraded with Kontakt-1 explosive reactive armor on the hull, turret and side skirts. Here you can see an example of a lot of reactive armor blocks. Be aware that I also have seen T-62MVs with less blocks as well. These tanks, according to Zaloga, had all other modifications of the T-62M, including the Wavner fire controls, Cessna systems and V-55U engine upgrade. Although at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, only about 113 of this variant were in service according to Zaloga, which makes sense if we consider that already in 1973 the T-72 tank replaced the T-62 on the Soviet production lines. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the T-62 remained in service in the Russian Federation. Most notably, it served in the war in Georgia in 2008. The T-62 was officially removed from service with the Russian army in 2013 by order of the Russian Ministry of Defense, having served reliably in the Soviet and lately in the Russian army for 5 decades. At that time, there remained approximately 2,500 T-62 tanks in strategic storage, which was reduced to 900 due to the balance present in the Russian Federation being cut up for scrap. According to current information from June 2022, T-62M and T-62MVs were put back into service to serve in the war in Ukraine. In terms of operational history, the T-62 saw a lot of action starting in 1968 during the Operation Danube, the invasion of Czechoslovakia. Although the first combat action was in 1969 at the border incident with China, where at least one T-62 was captured by Chinese forces. From 1973 ongoing, it saw action in around 20 conflicts according to Kinnear and Sewell. Although be aware, Wikipedia lists between 27 and 31, excluding the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Be sure to check out the screen because I won't read them out. So what are the major differences between the T-62 and T-72? Since for both tanks there are different variants, particularly T-72, we go with the T-62M and the T-72B3. The latter should be the most common T-72 variant in the Russian army after the T-72B and T-72BA at the beginning of 2022. For the T-62, I don't know which variant is more common, yet the main difference between the T-62M and the T-62MV are the explosive reactive armor blocks. Anyway, for the factors we also look at less common considered factors as well. The number of current operators for the T-62 are around 19, whereas the T-72 has around 42 according to Wikipedia. Although Kinnear and Sewell note a far higher number for the T-62. This leaves some of the former Soviet republics as well as 31 different countries worldwide continuing to use the T-62, nearly 6 decades after it entered production. Since the book is from 2021, I doubt this is a dating issue. The book also includes an appendix on countries the tank has been used by, and it is 42 countries. But this list includes Yemen 3 times as north, south and Haiti, Additionally, the United States is also listed, so the use seems to be used very liberally here. As such, I think the Wikipedia numbers are more correct here. If we assume the Wikipedia numbers are correct, this would mean that about 2 times more countries use the T-72s. Now, why is this important? Well, this is important if we assume that the various reports about the corruption in the Russian military are correct. There have been instances where officers were caught selling parts from tanks. Now, I'm not an expert in arms sales, but I suspect that the spare parts for the T-72 are generally in higher demand and are likely more valuable than those of T-62s, simply due to the fact that more countries use the T-72, and the T-72 is more modern. As such, T-62s from storage and otherwise are less likely to be salvaged for parts than T-72 in storage. When it comes to logistics and maintainability, it gets complicated. The T-62 is a simple and reliable tank. Overall, the T-62 proved to be a rugged and generally reliable design, with a relatively high assessed durability rate per 100 km driven. The main items likely to fail according to Soviet records were in the engine and main armament groups, mostly due to the much more powerful gun than the DOI-TS in the T-54 and T-55. Guaranteed running between capital rebuilding was 7,000 kilometers. Yet it is also far older, there are likely fewer parts available. This might be outweighed by the aforementioned corruption issues, but unlikely. I assume that the T-62s out of storage are probably in decent shape, but over the long run might have problems being maintained. Additionally, the question is how well mechanics can deal with the T-62s. It could be simple enough that it is not a major problem, but hard to tell. In overall, it is difficult to tell if the T-62 in that case is better than the T-72 in the current setting of the Russian army. I suspect in some respects the T-62 has the edge in simple repairs, while in other areas which require special equipment or spare parts, likely not. The next aspect is height, because here there's a clear trend with Soviet tanks in that regard. The height of the T-10 heavy tank was 2.43 meters, whereas the T-54 was 2.7. The T-62 had a height of 2.4 meters, while the T-72 has 2.26. The reduction in height usually comes with some drawbacks, namely less room for the crew. Following the Yom Kippur War in 1973, the Israelis evaluated captured T-55s and T-62s. Bad ventilation and cramped conditions inside the turret and the driver's compartment caused exhaustion during combat. There was even less headroom for the crews in the T-62 than in the T-54-55. Of course, this is a very hot region, so this might be less of an issue in the ongoing war in Ukraine, although be aware that summers can also be very hot in Ukraine as well. This also raises a question: how were the Soviets able to reduce the height of the T-72 even further? Well, this was partly achieved with the introduction of an autoloader. This also meant that the crew could be reduced by 1 man. So the T-62 has a 4-man crew while the T-72 has a 3-man crew. Although the loader is not a particularly complicated job, it requires a certain physical fitness. Additionally, every man counts, so one could man 4 T-72s or 3 T-62s with 12 men. It also depends on the standards of training. Usually tank crewmen are trained on several positions. For instance, Jens Wehner was trained as a driver and gunner on the Leopard 1 during his time as a conscript in the Bundeswehr. I'm not sure this is the same in the Russian armed forces, but I suspect it. A larger crew can also be beneficial in certain scenarios like maintenance or security. In terms of mobility, the T-72B3 has 1130 horsepower and a maximum speed of about 70 km per hour. With about 45 metric tons, we get a horsepower to ton ratio of 25.1. Meanwhile, the T-62M has 620 or 690 horsepower depending on the engine, and a maximum speed of about 50 km per hour. With a weight of 41.5 to 42 metric tons, we get a horsepower to ton ratio of 16.6 in the best case. So the T-62 is widely outclassed. This might be different in mountainous terrain though. One nuance of the T-62 design was that with its lower powered engine and wide ratio 5-speed transmission, it was found to be better suited for use in mountainous terrain, which is one of the reasons why the T-62 was widely used during the decade-long Soviet war in Afghanistan. Yet as far as I know, Ukraine does not have large areas of mountainous terrain. Maybe this benefit also helps in urban terrain or other areas as well, but I doubt in overall it would balance out the performance of the T-62. In terms of firepower, the T-72 has a 125mm gun and the T-62 a 150mm gun. Both can fire also anti-tank guided missiles, although the T-72 has better variants. Similar to mobility, the T-72 is clearly ahead here in many regards. Additionally, it is also questionable how much ammo for the 115mm gun is in stock. As such, the T-62 has no benefit in any way in this regard unless I missed something. Of course, the real question here needs to be asked, if the weaker gun makes that much of a difference in real life. Against most targets like infantry fighting vehicles and armored personnel carriers, the penetration and other values are less important. Accuracy is more important here. So in overall, the T-62 in most scenarios should be enough. So the accuracy and ammunition question are the most significant factors here. In terms of armor protection, the situation is similar. I could not find any data for the T-72B3, but Zaloga provides data for older variants, namely the T-72B1. He notes for the frontal turret the protection of 520mm against armor-piercing fin stabilized discarding saber and 950mm against heat ammo. As you can see, the difference is that the B1 is equipped with Kontakt-1 explosive reactive armor, whereas the B3 has Kontakt-5, that also provides additional protection against armor-piercing fin stabilized discarding saber. For the T-62M, I have two sources that note about 450mm against heat ammo for the turret with the brow applique armor mounted. Meanwhile, the armor-piercing fin stabilized discarding saber, the protection of the T-62M is about 380mm. In short, the T-72 is also better off here. Yet again, here the numbers might be quite misleading, since against modern anti-tank guided missiles, more protection might not necessarily help, since it's still not enough or it is bypassed due to top attacks or other measures. Although at first I thought the T-62s could have better survivability due to the lack of an autoloader and thus better ammunition distribution, the difference according to the viewers seems to be minor. To summarize, in overall the T-62M and the T-62MVs on paper are significantly weaker than the T-72B3. This is not surprising, but it should not be forgotten that the Russian armed forces also uses T-72s that are less upgraded, and maybe also less properly maintained. Additionally, there are other vehicles currently in operation like the BTR-80 and the BMP-2 or BMP-1 that in most regards are less protected and have less firepower than the T-62M and MVs. So the T-62s are clearly outdated tanks but still capable armored fighting vehicles. As so often similar to the Leopard 1, the devil is in the details depending on how the tank is actually used and what opposition it is going up against. I hope you learned something new. Thank you to Tobias for helping out with sources and discussions about force numbers and survivability. Thank you to Andrew for reviewing the script and providing additional remarks. Thank you to Stanimir Dobrev for providing additional information about corruption regarding T-72 parts. Thank you to Tankolad for clearing up the protection levels of the T-62M turret. Thank you to the Panzermuseum Munster and the Tank Museum at Borington for inviting me in 2019. Special thanks to all my supporters for making trips to museums and military archives possible. As always, sources are listed in the description. Thank you for watching and see you next time.